Now, for our topic today, we are discussing issues related to the pandemic, especially issues related to inequality in the pandemic. And as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us of our mutual interdependence and the need for collective and coordinated global effort and action anchored in solidarity to combat this threat. And yet we've seen that despite this particular threat, which poses a lot to our survival as a human race, the global response to combat the pandemic tend to mirror the deep inequalities of our world. According to our World in Data statistics, 60.8% of the world population has received at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. 10 billion doses have been administered globally, and 25 million are now administered daily. Yet, only 9.8% of people in low-income countries, that's less than 10%, have received at least one dose. And the United Nations has warned that vaccine inequality between nations has allowed the COVID pandemic to continue spreading and increased the chances of variants emerging that could evade the current crop of vaccines. To lead our conversations today on issues of solidarity, vaccine, apartheid and inequity, global health and environment and human rights, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our three panelists. First, I'll introduce you to Professor Obiora Okafor. Professor Okafor is the Edward B. Berling Chair in International Law and Institutions at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. Professor Okafor has served since August 2017 as the UN Independent Expert on Human Rights and International Solidarity, which is one of the principal groups of human rights experts who advise and report annually to the UN Human Rights Council and General Assembly, and a former chairperson of the UN Human Rights Council Advisory Group. He has taught international law at the Osgood Law School here at York University, Carleton University in Ottawa, and the University of Nigeria in Enugu. He has also served as the SSRC MacArthur Foundation Visiting Scholar at Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program, a Canada-US Fulbright Scholar at MIT, a visiting professor at the International Institute of Human Rights in Strasbourg, France, etc., etc. There's a lot about Professor Okafor that I cannot say today, but I just want you to welcome Professor Okafor to our conversations today. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this with us today. Next is Rujeen Habibi. Rujeen Habibi is currently a PhD candidate at Osgood Law School here at York University, and is a research fellow, international consultant, and lawyer who is specialized in global health and human rights law. Her work is guided by the premise that the interplay of laws, norms, and power relations from global to grassroots levels is what ultimately shapes health equity, and the fulfillment of health as a human right. As a doctoral candidate at Osgood Law School, Rujeen explores the role of epistemic communities and civil society actors in the progressive development of health-related human rights norms. She holds a Joseph Armand Bombardier Canada Graduate Doctoral Award and has published in a range of peer-reviewed and medical journals. Welcome, Rujeen, and thank you for joining us. Now, Dr. S. Harris Ali is a professor of sociology here at York University. His research focuses on the intersection of health, disasters, and environment. He is a sociologist and engineer by training, and therefore adopts an interdisciplinary approach that consciously strives to integrate biophysical with social factors in analysis to form a more comprehensive understanding of environmental disaster issues. Professor Ali has published extensively on disease outbreaks, including SARS in 2003, the global spread of avian flu, and Ebola. His co-edited volume with Professor Kale, Network Diseases, Emerging Infections in the Global City, has recently been recognized by the Globe and Mail as one of the top 10 books that offer lessons from past pandemics. He's also currently a co-principal investigator on a Canada Institute of Health research grant that involves big data analysis and AI to understand the role of social media in framing and countering anti-Asian racism during the present COVID response. Welcome, Professor Ali, and welcome to our panelists. I'll now give you the floor to start with your introductory remarks. So I think I will start with Professor Okafor.
Thank you so much, Professor Bauer. Very happy to be here. It's a great event. I only have 7 minutes, so I'll move directly to the few points that I want to emphasize. Well, needless to say, we are in a global crisis, health crisis, and emphasis, stress is on global. It seems obvious, but it doesn't seem to register, in my view. It is a global crisis. And this is not going to be the last one. It wasn't the first one either. And so it's important to get it right in terms of policy, in terms of the law, in terms of action. And we are in this together, right? There's no end, as sadly has been empirically demonstrated with Omicron. There's no end for anyone, including the vaccinated, the boosted, until it ends for everyone. Again, this doesn't seem to register in actual fact. There's a lot of rhetoric, but it doesn't actually register. So far, I would give the world a failing grade, but the world here is simply diplomatese for the global north and transnational corporations, especially big pharma, because they are the ones that have the levers, the key levers to make the policy much better. And this failure, lest we forget, is not harmless. It has led to serious excess harm. And by excess harm, I mean harms that might not otherwise have resulted, okay? Especially from more variants, excess deaths, and so on. And we can elaborate in the conversation. For sure, there's been good ideas, good work, good practices of international solidarity in this area. The COVAX facility was a great idea. The rapid invention of vaccines, I call it miracle. Those who know me know I'm not very religious, but science is my religion. It is a miracle. If you want a miracle, that's a miracle. And I say that because if you go back to 1818, cholera pandemic, people just died in their millions. 1918, wiped out 500,000 Nigerians. It didn't even start from Africa. The population at the time of maybe 10 million. Okay, so let's put it in perspective. So the vaccines are a miracle. Vaccine donations have occurred. Some vaccination has gone on around the world other than the rich countries. But the failures far outweigh the successes and the good practices. The very brazen, in my view, undermining of the COVAX facility by rich states making parallel deals and buying up and holding all the vaccines has undermined COVAX and led to the situation we're in. The tendency to ship vaccines to poor countries close to the expiry is another brazen example of bad practices. Gavi, the UN Secretary General himself, have made this point. Nigeria just burnt 1 million vaccines that were shipped weeks to the expiry. The vaccines that have been donated are a drop in the bucket of the need that we have. And there's been a failure to vaccinate the overwhelming majority of the world, especially in the poor states. I've argued elsewhere already in several fora that the failure to show international solidarity is actually not just a matter of charity or a lack thereof, or a failure of imagination, or a failure of enlightened self-interest, but also, in addition, a flagrant breach of international human rights law, emphasis on law. Let me explain very briefly, and I'm going to throw out a few provisions here, and I know we don't have time to elaborate, and we can do that in conversation if people are interested. I begin with the broad mandates in Articles 55 and 56 of the UN Charter. It is a general human rights obligation, it's a binding treaty to all states to advance human rights, including health rights, everywhere. Okay, that exists. Article 28 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, not formally binding, but very persuasive with law. Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms in that declaration, including health rights, can be fully realized. Clearly, this is not happening. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 2, imposes an international legal obligation to cooperate and provide international assistance to realize all human rights, including health rights. And I'll end with this. These provisions impose international legal duties to cooperate to advance all human rights, including health rights, which is an aspect of international solidarity as the UN defines it, and will be evacuated of all content, of all real meaning, if they did not require such international solidarity in our current global circumstance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Okafor. And I do agree about vaccines being miracles, how it's not registered that we need the kind of solidarity you just hinted at to move us forward is a whole other conversation that we will have. Regine, please, if you may give us your opening remarks.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you, Professor Okafor, for the wonderful opening speech. I think building up on that, I might describe first a op-ed that Professor Okafor, I had the privilege of publishing with Professor Okafor and Professor Uche Ngwaba at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law and Professor Sanjay Ruparelia at Ryerson University. That was an op-ed published earlier this month, whereby we were taking back the readers to some of the lessons we've learned, or at least the lessons that we should have learned by now in dealing with COVID-19. And we felt that it was a particularly crucial time to insert this conversation, particularly because states have started to look forward to new law reform efforts under the auspices of the WHO, so the World Health Organization, as a way of preventing a similar crisis from happening again in the future, or at least from happening with the same intensity and longevity that it has happened now in the future. Now, these forward-looking efforts, such as a potential new treaty on pandemics or potential amendments to existing international laws, they're happening even as our world leaders, particularly those who lead the world's wealthier countries, continue to fail in vaccinating more than 90% of people in low-income countries with a single dose against COVID-19. And we've had effective vaccines for close to a year now. Over 10 billion doses have been administered worldwide. So it is appalling that we haven't found a solution for the mass and equitable immunization of people across the globe. And so in our Globe and Mail op-ed earlier this month, we pleaded for world leaders, including Canada's own Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and other ministers leading Canada's global COVID response, to look to the lessons of the past and to occupy space on the right side of history. Now, when we're talking about lessons of the past, we really mean there are two types of pasts we can look at. The first is the past of the immediate past, so the 3 years that we've been living with COVID, now in our third year. And the second is the lessons of a more distant past that is not all that different from the current state of affairs and what we're seeing today. And that is the past of responding to the explosive growth of HIV in the 1990s and early 2000s. And I'll share some thoughts on our collective experience with both. So first, going to lessons of the current moment, We are now, as we've said, in year 3 of the pandemic. We've experienced not only the original virus causing COVID-19, but also several of its variants since. Each variant seems to be more transmissible than the next, and there are more concerning and therefore more constraining and a strain to hospitals wherever these variants arise. But we're only beginning to emerge from the weight of Omicron, and already it seems as if talks of vaccine equity are dying down. The Omicron was the most transmissible version of this virus yet, but it may not be the last, and many scientists don't bet on it being the last. We've been told by public health experts time and again over the past year that we will continue to see new variants emerge if we let the virus run through our population or through any population unchecked. The more opportunities we give this virus to mutate, the greater the risk we'll see another variant emerge. And I think Dr. Madhukar Pai raised an interesting analogy when he said, well, we're playing whack-a-mole with the virus. And I think he is absolutely right on that front. So the lesson we should have learned from the immediate past is one of prioritization and long-term outlook. Doses are still trickling through COVAX, and sometimes even bilaterally, but often they're only reaching people at close to expiry. We have to be clear that doses reaching people at close to expiry is far from charity. And actually, charity isn't even enough in this pandemic, as Professor Okafor has already driven home the point. We do not need charity. Experts studying past donations of medicines, medical devices, and other equipment have shed insight into how these donations, when they are close to expiry, actually create wastage, not only of the resource that's been donated, but of the resources of the recipient country, because now the recipient country has to rush to dispose of the donations that they've been given. So that takes away personnel and resources from the much needed COVID public health response. So we have to be clear we're harming low-income countries and hindering their public health response when we're giving away doses in such a way. And moreover, that also breeds and helps to fans the flames of arguments around vaccine hesitancy, because who would want a vaccine that is not a wanted vaccine, right? What image does that give to a recipient country that a rich country is only giving you the types of vaccines it's not putting on in its own people? So the image and the optics matter. But I think it's also important to look at Canada and to look at what it's really done versus what it's committed to. So Canada has distributed just since past December across Canada 14 million doses across the country, more than 14 million doses to respond to the surge in boosters campaign. But that is 2 million doses more than Canada has physically donated in total over the course of the pandemic to other countries. So if we are to rely on dose donations alone, as the pharmaceutical industry would like us to, it will take several more years to finally make our exit out of this pandemic. But as I also mentioned earlier, we have a longer view of how to address this pandemic in our interconnected world. And in our op-ed, we cite the HIV pandemic specifically, not because we see it as a success story, although we've been told by some critics of the op-ed that you're painting HIV too much in a celebratory light when HIV is still an ongoing reality. And that I fully agree with. But we cite HIV as an excellent illustration of the ways through which the mass mobilization of advocacy through protests, strategic litigation, and through the vernacularization of the right to health as a language allowed activists to reconceptualize such a right as one requiring access to life-saving medicines. And it forced the hands of governments and pharmaceutical companies and international organizations to change the rules of the game, making it easier to import generic versions of these drugs. So now, at that time, low-income countries could access antiretrovirals at $350 per person per year instead of $15,000 per person per year. The TRIPS waiver that has been languishing at the World Trade Organization for more than a year, its terms would allow the waiving of intellectual property rules, and it would that now prevents the wider scale up of vaccine manufacturing across the globe. We've been told by pharmaceutical industries that the waiver is a lost cause. The reason being that there are not enough manufacturing capacity. The technology is too advanced, and there are not enough hubs in the world that can actually potentially create mRNA vaccines. But just as late as last year, MSF, together with Access IPSA, has found that there are over 100 manufacturers in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that have the technical requirements and quality standards to potentially make mRNA vaccines if given access to the knowledge and know-how. So I'm almost done, and I just want to end with two key thoughts. The first is that the British sociologist Graham Scrambler suggests that COVID-19 can be viewed as a sort of breaching experiment. That is, by disrupting the normal social order, it allows us to see its rules more clearly. The common thread in speeches that have been made by politicians all around the world is that we're facing an unprecedented public health crisis. And it's useful to ask them, how is it an unprecedented public health crisis? Is it unprecedented in the speed or transmissibility of the pathogen? Or is it unprecedented in the broad way with which the pathogen has gained foothold in countries around the world? Or maybe it's unprecedented in the ways in which it lays bare the social structures and inequalities that have fanned the expansion and continue the ravaging of virus around the world. Solidarity, as Professor Okafor has said, should be guiding every decision we make in this pandemic. And it's not just out of a sense of benevolence, and it's not just because it's a core part of our collective exit strategy for this pandemic, but simply because, as the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu has wisely said, describing the African tenet of Ubuntu, a person is a person through other persons. Our humanity comes into its own through community and belonging. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you very much, Eugene, for ending on that really good note or excellent note of Ubuntu, but also that question of what lessons should we have learned by now? And it's an excellent segue into, I'm guessing, Professor Ali's own opening remarks, given that he's also done work on past pandemics or past infectious diseases and can speak to some of these issues as well. Professor Ali.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint. Just because I've been teaching for so many years with this thing, I've become accustomed to it, despite myself. Okay, can you see this screen?
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. All right. So let me begin, and I want to take up some of the points that the other two speakers have raised, and I want to put it into a bit more historical context as well. As Regina said, it's important to consider both the deeper history and the more recent history. And so really that's what this talk deals with. It's a talk based on an article I have put out with Dr. Masoka Fala, who's my friend and colleague, who's based in Monrovia in Liberia, where he actually led the Ebola response in that area. So this is something that we jointly produced, and it's going to be published in Studies in Political Economy, probably in the next issue. So the questions we look at is, again, looking at the history of things, how does colonial discourses and practices affect vaccine uptake and vaccine equity today? Okay. And how is vaccine nationalism and vaccine imperialism the result of the post-colonial project? Because as we'll see, what we're dealing with today in terms of vaccine distribution and vaccine inequity is about nationalism, and it's about imperialism in a new form, in a more contemporary form. So let's look back. Because ultimately, colonialism is based on an ideology of othering or racism, however you want to take it. And this has a long history, and it has taken on different forms throughout history, right? And so if you look way back to the 17th and early 20th century, when the colonial empires were in full force, there was a discourse, and we're going to be looking at discourse now, a discourse of tropicality, okay, where the people who were colonizing said, oh, there's all these disease threats in these areas. We have to do something. And the solution to do something was the Western colonial medicine. Okay, so other people became a source of disease, a source of threat. Okay, a way of thinking that continues today. Okay, but later on, as the countries got independence, right, the discourse changed, but there is still an othering. Okay, these are the days of the development and developmentalism to deal with the poverty. Okay, because the dominant view was, oh, this poverty is causing a lot of problems, and it will spread even to the global north, and so on. And so this is the so-called enlightened self-interest, which we'll talk about again when we talk about the vaccines and the distribution. And the solution to poverty that was proffered was Western investment or aid, okay, to help these others. Again, the othering discourse persisted. Right, and then more recently, late 20th century, natural disasters became the focus. Oh, the developing world has so many of these natural disasters, and they don't have the technology to deal with it. And so the answer to that problem, okay, that these others experience is science and relief, Western science as a form of aid and relief. And, we're still dealing with that mentality today, as we'll talk about. Okay. Now, more recently, and I'm not going to get into this too much, is this othering discourse takes the form of, after 9/11, takes the form of criminality, that the Muslim person is defined as a criminal. Okay, and the solution to terrorism that is ostensibly coming from the Middle East, right, according to some in the global north, the solution to that is Western democracy. So Western solutions are always offered to deal with the other. And this sort of mentality is something that we have to take into account today when we're dealing with the COVID distribution. Okay, another way of talking about this othering process is you can refer to as the esteem of separation, where you have the scapegoating of specific places and populations as source of infection for Westerners, right? Going all the way back in the discourse, right? But today you see it in terms of anti-Asian racism, another project that I'm working on with Fuyuki Karasawa, again, based on an othering process. Okay. So what are the effects then of these discourses from the past in relation to infectious diseases? Well, awareness of past experimentation and research on vaccine development in Africa, particularly deadly pathogens that could be weaponized. This is well known to many people in the African countries. They know that that pharmaceutical companies are setting up shop there and running trials, and they know that many of the people there, they don't know their rights. They're not educated. They're taken advantage of. They're being viewed instrumentally for the sake of these vaccine trials. They're being exploited. And this is just a more recent iteration of past exploitation, of course. There's exploitation of labor before with the slave trade. Then, the exploitation of natural resources, right? And now exploitation of the body for research. It's just another iteration. They know that, right? And so today, based on this past, many people are suspicious in Africa. Can you blame them? Right? They see the hypocrisy of the international community when it comes to vaccine, the promise of global vaccine coverage to end the pandemic, while at the same time, the unwillingness to expedite vaccine deployment to the African continent, okay? For example, by not waiving patent rights to the vaccine so that the vaccine could be produced locally and affordably to those in the global south, as was mentioned by Ruji in her talk. So where are we today? Okay, well, it's interesting because there's been a certain confluence of developments at the discursive level, at the institutional level, in dealing with public health and infectious disease that has taken us to where we are today and has influenced the vaccine response. Okay, and one of these things is what's called the emerging infectious disease worldview. If you think about it, over the past 25 years or 35 years or whatever, there's been an onslaught of what are called new and emerging disease, all sorts of diseases, Zika virus, COVID-19 as we're dealing with, SARS, Ebola, hantavirus, pulmonary syndrome, Lyme disease, Clostridium difficile, even the prion, the mad cow disease, right? And the list goes on and on and on. And these are just from the top of my head. So there was a sort of concern, okay, because this process was already happening in the 1990s, right? And a conference was held in the United States, headed by Stephen M. Morse, who was a very famous virologist, and all these scientists came together and they said, yes, this is a big issue, emerging infections. Best-selling publications came out at the time, The Hot Zone by Richard Pleston, The Coming Plague by Laurie Garrett, right? And at the same time, neoliberal cuts were coming to public health. And they said, oh, you can't cut money to public health because we're dealing with new and emerging diseases. And in fact, it's such an important issue that the Defense Department has become involved in the United States because infectious disease is seen now as a security issue, a national security issue. So funding was started to be funneled in to infectious disease research, including research in African countries for trials and vaccine developments. Okay, and this led to an emphasis on the nation state and nationalism, which we see today with vaccine nationalism in relation to infectious diseases. Okay, and as we said, various funding was poured into various aspects of infectious diseases, increasing the capacity for epidemiological surveillance of infectious diseases, training in basic research in molecular biology and virology, the strengthening of and coordination between local, national, and international public health institutions, as well as increased attention to public and private development of what? Vaccines, right? So there is a history to this as well, okay, to the vaccine development. Okay, the widespread interest and appeal of the emerging infectious disease worldview was largely predicated on the perceived need to bolster the US economy and security interests during a time of recession. Okay, so all this has set the stage for what we see today. Okay, these different discourses, the emerging infectious disease worldview, have set the stage for today's vaccine nationalism. Government agreements with vaccine manufacturers to enable certain countries to receive vaccines ahead of others. Okay, and this is just another form of, post-colonial practices of predatory capitalism. Kasabov notes that vaccine, this is in Al Jazeera, he notes that vaccine nationalism is really vaccine capitalism based on conventional neoliberal supply and demand principles. We all know about neoliberalism. We learn about it in university, privatization and, lack of regulation and so forth. So rich countries cornering a market where you have inadequate supply. This is what's happening with the vaccines, a condition arising because of refusal of Western pharmaceutical companies unwilling to share their patent, even though some places in the global south, like India and South Africa, for instance, have the technology to mass produce the vaccine. Those vaccines that are locally produced, if you're fortunate enough to do so in the global south, are being shipped to the West instead of being available locally. These are forms of vaccine nationalism. Okay. Yeah, I had other slides, but I don't know what happened to them. But that's okay. So this idea about the distribution of the vaccine and how it's inequitably distributed has a history, not just a short history, but a long history. And I will leave it at that. I have a lot to say about this and can if the questions are asked, but thank you. And thank you, Sylvia, also for inviting me to this panel.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I'm going to stop sharing. There we go.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that historical overview of what's been happening. And I think all three of you have mentioned that, these are not new things, and to Regine's point, what is new really about this pandemic? And so I'd like to ask, are COVID vaccines a global common good? What compelling reasons do we have in expecting that wealthy nations share these kinds of vaccines? And to extend that conversation a little further, is this a moral argument? Is this merely a moral argument? What kind of an argument do we really have in expecting these kinds of, the kind of sharing and obligation, that countries meet the kinds of obligations that you've talked about?
Yeah, I can go first if you want.
Anyone can go.
I mean, I think, just on a very sort of fundamental level, you can see vaccine equity issues as being defined in terms of, what you call the rational self-interest or enlightened self-interest, which is a term I don't like, right? Because enlightened self-interest, like self-interest, is not necessarily a good thing anytime, right? But the whole idea of rational self-interest when you're dealing with something emotional is kind of weird in itself. But enlightened self-interest is there and plays a role because, as was mentioned by Dr. Okafor, if you don't deal with the vaccine, if you don't eliminate virus, if you don't eliminate the virus, don't eradicate it altogether, it's given pockets of opportunities to survive and mutate and change and take different variant forms. And that's what you see today. This is why these new variants keep coming up, right? Because, it's not being eradicated from certain pockets in the world, basically the global south, and therefore given the opportunity and the chance to evolve into different variants. So you're never going to get rid of the problem until you completely get rid of the problem. Yeah, you see what I mean?
Exactly. And Professor Okafor?
Yes, I agree entirely with what Dr. Ali has just said. Can you hear me? Okay, yes. It's not just moral, it's also interest-based, whether enlightened or not. It's also legal. Made that point several times, almost too many times, since the beginning, literally, of the pandemic. So it's not just a moral obligation, it is a legal obligation. In already existing instruments, the hope is that the new pandemic treaty will also inscribe that, but it exists already. It's not even contentious, really. It's just that, as I was arguing in the paper I was writing earlier this morning, it seems that, there seems to be a kind of head in the sand approach whenever self-interest kind of emerges for particular countries, and this flips across the global north-south, and then you kind of cover your eyes and pretend that the legal text is no longer before you. So that's all that is happening. No legal international human rights scholar can seriously argue that these obligations are not inscribed in the UN Charter or in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights or in the Universal Declaration, which, when it comes to things like democracy, are cited very robustly in the language of solidarity to the victims in the global south. But when they're all dying for COVID-19, all of a sudden the solidarity is either eclipsed or elided. So that's my view on it. Thank you.
I would love to jump in the conversation. I agree with both Professor Harris and Professor Okafor, but I feel beyond the discourse on self-interest and legal parameters, it's more on why are the people at the table who are making decisions not putting in the consideration of people in the global south. I found a statistic that kind of points to how drastic this is. The ourworldindata.org looked at high-income countries, upper middle-income countries, and lower middle-income countries and low-income countries. I know it's an economic scale, but we can still work with it here. And it says the total doses per 100 people. So in high-income countries, 147 people out of 100 people have their total doses. In middle-income countries, it's 46 out of 100 people have their doses. 68 people in lower middle-income countries have their doses, and only 7 out of 100 people in low-income countries have their total doses. And just looking at that, there's clearly, once we said hoarding, the hoarding of the vaccines. if your country is more than overly prepared to vaccinate your people, why can't you take the rest and give it to the South? It's just, for me as a student, I'm not that knowledgeable on maybe the why aspect, but I come to this conversation to maybe we can understand why it's not happening. Is it really just the self-interest, or they don't mind breaking laws, like national laws, for their own self-interest? Why? How come? And it's maybe a bit philosophical. Oh, I'm sorry. But yes, that's more of my question.
Yeah, and Regine, if you could, just take that as well as you answer the question or respond. I mean, yes, this abandonment of what one can just call common sense. Why is it happening, really? If you have answers to the why as well, Regine.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and thank you for raising it, Tawanga. I on why, there's people with different epistemic lenses come at this with different answers, I think. Some come at it from the lens of it's neo-colonialism at play. This is exactly how the system's supposed to work, and this is what the system is doing. I think that some might also look at it as sort of a path dependency trajectory that we are in right now, in the sense that when COVAX was being built, I think Professor Okafor did a great job of describing this. When it was being built, the hope was that COVAX, because at the time there were no effective vaccines, it was various manufacturers creating vaccines, and we didn't know which ones would be effective. So countries had to make bets with different types of manufacturers and hedge their bets and hedge their contracts so that they could eventually purchase. One of their purchase deals would create would amount to an effective vaccine that they could give to their population. So COVAX tried to diversify the manufacturers it started to go to and created deals with them. The problem with that was, and the idea with COVAX was to unify the world's bargaining power. So you would have this one central authority that's negotiating with all the other manufacturers. Who has bargaining power here? It's the one central authority that represents the world's countries and is negotiating with the pharmaceutical countries, right? Because the pharmaceutical companies want to sell their vaccines at the end of the day. If they have only one person with whom they're or one entity with whom they're negotiating, it's in their interest to do so. So it's not in their interest to do so. I'm so sorry. I'm very tired. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that didn't happen. All the wealthier countries ended up cutting to the front of the queue and negotiating their own bilateral deals. That created a path dependency whereby we, of course, didn't know how long the effectiveness of vaccines would last. So now we're in the situation where we need boosters, and we don't know how many more boosters we're going to need to protect ourselves from future variants. Because of the track we set very early on in the pandemic, we're now in a situation where rich countries will continue to try to cut to the front of the queue as much as possible to get the vaccines they need for their people in this environment of scientific uncertainty. And it's the scientific uncertainty that's really, I think, driving this lack of sharing. It's this worry that what do we like, because governments just want to get elected, right? So when is the next variant going to come up? How are we going to have a stockpile of vaccines to give to the entire population? I'm just thinking as a world leader who needs to get elected in the next 5 years or so, what is at the front of their mind? It's thinking, I don't want to botch up the pandemic response in the national setting first, and then we can worry about other countries. So I think that is part of what's happening here, but I also don't discount the fact that there is for sure post-colonial structures and the forces of neocolonialism at play here as well. And of course, racism is, I think, an underlying theme, as we've seen with Omicron and as we've seen with the travel restrictions that were set against South Africa, while the Netherlands had detected Omicron before South Africa, but had even detected it.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a very quick point, 1 minute. I agree entirely with what Regine just said, but I just wanted to put out this scenario, which I find particularly interesting. Imagine if, there was some research like this, like a vaccine, that Zambia or Ghana had, right? And people were dying in the US, and they said, well, we got to get elected in Zambia. Therefore, we're not giving it to you. You only have to read the American Journal of International Law in the 70s about the OPEC oil crisis and the recommendations of actually sane, reasonable American international lawyers about how they need to march on and seize Middle Eastern oil in order to fuel American cars, to understand what the global north would do if it was Ghana that had this vaccine and wasn't sharing, right? So I completely understand what Regine is saying, but we wouldn't call any slack to any global South leader who made a similar argument with a similar sort of structure, right? I just wanted to point that out. And this ties in partly to Harris's point, right? And because this is also ideational in the way we cut slack all the time to these excuses from global north leaders, right? So I just wanted to add that kind of tongue in cheek. Thank you.
Yeah, and you know, and I am glad that no one is marching on Ghana for that reason. You know, Professor Kafu, you've also argued elsewhere, for instance, and I quote you to yourself, that realizing the vision embodied by human rights requires bolder measures and commitments to international solidarity than the world has so far witnessed, unquote. Do you think we are seeing an empathy deficit or an erosion of solidarity in the world globally? And I'd like you know, all of you to take a stab at this. What's happening? Is it that are we tired? Are we tired of responding to war here, to famine here? I mean, beyond the pandemic, what's happening really? Can you speak to that a bit as well, first as expert in on international solidarity and whatnot? So.
I'm going to annoy a few more people by what I'm going to say again, tongue in cheek. Erosion assumes there was something to erode in the first place, right? I'm not that sure there was anything to erode to begin with, right? So, or there was very little to begin with to erode. This is partly driven by the paper I'm working on, as I said, so kind of part dependent, Rujin, for me, you know, the paper I'm working on now, where I'm talking about these flippings in solidarity and state sovereignty argumentation, whenever it appears to be in somebody's interest on both sides of the global north-south axis. I think really what is happening is that there was a deficit that was simply exposed. Right? It was like this unveiling of the deficit or highlighting of a deficit that has been there historically, right? You know, so if you want to show solidarity, you know, on democracy and all that, you know, how people organize their elections, but not, you know, in terms of when they're actually dying or about to die, you know, and you put that on a scale, that tells you a lot. So I'll leave it at that. I'm not so sure there was any erosion happening here.
Sorry, I was muted. On that, I just finished telling someone that you know, there's this new vaccine that's being that has been developed and that's being tested or run around, you know, shared with certain of the LMICs. So it's the Corbavax vaccine, and the producers of that have made it very clear publicly through the news and through their various interviews with media that they're not going to enforce intellectual IP rights on that vaccine, and they're going to try to distribute it widely. And this is going to be the vaccine for global health. And if that vaccine does end up changing vaccine equity, or if it does end up solving the solution of vaccine equity, I want us to be very clear that it is in spite of world leaders that it will work. And the reason it is that it will be in spite of world leaders is because the US government did not even take this vaccine seriously or give it the sort of funding or resources that it needed the way it had funded the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. the producers of that vaccine had to go out, they're from Baylor College of Medicine in Texas, they had to go out and search private sources of funding for it. So this vaccine, if it does end up changing the calculus or the equation of vaccine equity in the world, it's going to be in spite of world leaders, and that will be wonderful. It would be a bittersweet lesson for us all, because it would mean that we've still not learned what we should have learned maybe even 40 decades ago. We still haven't learned it. And like, as Professor Okafor said, it's there's nothing to erode because there was nothing there in the first place. But I would agree with that statement.
And Professor Ali, you've also made an argument that, you know, there's a difference in terms of the handling of these kinds of diseases as they happen. And you've said, and specifically, you've talked about networked inequality in your work. And I'd just like for you to talk a little bit about that. What similarities and differences really are you seeing in terms of the handling of the different epidemics that you've studied, in terms of where they are located, so to speak, or, you know, how it is that, as you earlier on discussed, the separation, the epistemic sort of separation that happens because of their geographical location. If you can just speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, if you look at the different outbreaks, at least the ones that I've studied, you know, a lot of factors come into play on how the disease spread and the response and reaction to it. And if you observe the response and reaction in particular, you get a glimpse of how nation states deal with inequality in their countries, but also globally. You know, the thing with SARS in 2003, you know, it was a coronavirus as well. And it started in the Guangdong province in China. But its spread was interesting because its spread was through the global cities network, it's called. You know, global cities are these sort of command and control posts of the international economy. And certain cities exert more of a force on the globalized economy, like, you know, London, Paris, Tokyo, New York, and so on. And then the global cities people tier the global cities into alpha global cities like London and New York, and then beta cities and gamma cities and so on. So you had like Singapore, Hong Kong, Toronto, these sorts of cities being the epicenters of the spread of SARS, right? But here's the thing. Like, these cities are, you know, some of the most advanced industrial capitalist sort of places in the world, right? And the disease spread through that. Okay. Well, then what happened with the COVID-19? Right, this was an international spread affecting both the poor regions of the world as well as the rich regions of the world. Right. And by the way, one of the reasons why vaccine development was able to take place so efficiently and quickly and swiftly for COVID-19 was because much of the research was done on vaccine development for the SARS coronavirus. And that was sitting on the shelf for quite a bit of time until it was revisited with COVID-19. Right. The other thing about SARS is that it was a wake-up call and a dress rehearsal for COVID-19 in the sense that all the scientists had to put aside their competitive aspirations for the first time in history in an unprecedented way, using the new, you know, internet technologies to share information and data, and were able to quickly characterize the genetic code of the SARS coronavirus in record time. You know, I remember interviewing in Hong Kong the person who discovered SARS as the causative agent of the disease, and he was even amazed at this too, right? And anyways, so when COVID-19 came about, you know, there was an immediate mobilization both for vaccine development and the record-breaking pace at which the genetic code of the virus was able to be deciphered. And that's very important because it's only when you decipher the genetic code of the virus can you develop the vaccine, because you know the shape of the virus particle. Anyways, But in terms of inequality, right? Let's take a look at Ebola, which is another disease epidemic that I study. You know, it's interesting, and Masoko Fala, my partner, has always pointed it out, that Ebola and COVID-19 spread in different directions, and it illustrates the inequality in this way. Yeah, let me just cancel this. You know, COVID-19 spread, Ebola spread from sort of the poor areas to the richer areas of cities. Okay, so you would have the situation that, you know, people would visit relatives in remote and rural areas, which tend to be more impoverished. Then they would come to the city for work. You know, they'd stay at someone's house, and then when they stayed into someone's house in the informal settlement, they would become infected. But who are these people in the informal settlement? You know, well, these are the people who serve as the sort of security guards and the nannies, the cooks, the drivers, the domestics for the people in the richer areas of, like, what I studied, Monrovia, right? So the disease of Ebola actually spread from the sort of poorer people to the richer people. Okay, but the spread of COVID-19 was opposite. It was these people, you know, academics, business people, international travelers, you know, who got the disease first, you know, from conferences or whatever, brought it to their home, and then when the domestics and the guards and the cooks came to work in those homes, they took the disease back, COVID-19, back to the informal settlements. Right, so the direction of the disease is opposite, and that's a very interesting thing. When the disease was a disease of the poor, no one pays attention to it, right? When it becomes a disease of the rich, you know, people pay attention to it. This is why Suzuki, you know, one of the documentaries I showed to the environment and health classes, you know, Suzuki mentions that, you know, no one sort of pays attention or invests in, you know, medicines for tuberculosis, you know, because now for tuberculosis, you have to take all these big capsules, you know, over a long period of time, and it's very cumbersome. No one invents something to be much more easy to take because there's no money in it. On the other hand, Viagra is something that people will invest in, pharmaceuticals, because they can make money. So diseases of the poor are ignored, right? That's one of the things, right? Now, if you look at the different disease outbreaks and you look at the responses I started with, you could look at the different axes of inequality: age, gender, race, ethnicity, and social class, right? And you can see how the responses are different, right? And one of the kind of, I guess, positive things of the COVID-19 response is that it revealed many of the entrenched and taken for granted inequalities in society. So when Regine said it was a breaching experiment, quoting Graham Scrambler, the sociologist from England, UK, you know, that's exactly right. It was a breaching experience. You know, the sociologists know from, you know, ethnomethodology, breaching experiments are those where the taken for granted sense of reality is broken. Right. And this is what's happened with the COVID-19. And in so doing, it's revealed inequalities of various types. For example, age and what's happening in long-term care facilities. So much of our existence is out of sight, out of mind. You know, many environmental problems are like that, but so is in Western society the care for the aged and the elderly. Right. The plight of the elderly came to a front with COVID-19. It is no coincidence that Black Lives Matter, death of Mr. Floyd, what was happening in residential schools, all these represent forms of inequality, came out during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? You know, the so-called, what we used to call the precariat, which we now call essential workers, and the plight of these people and their differential susceptibility to COVID-19 was also brought out, right? Gender, you know, you talk about intimate partner violence. If the person is isolated, people are isolated and quarantined in the home, they are also isolated and quarantined with the person who may abuse them. Right? You can talk about gender inequality being exposed, that you know many women have to not only take care of the household, take care of the children and the elderly, but also have to continue to work you know, while they're at home, right? So the inequalities are related to that. right? The remote locations and the spread of infectious disease in First Nations places. The migrant workers who live in these sort of conditions where they're packed together, right? They have greater exposure to the disease. There's tons of inequalities that were revealed by COVID. What does the future hold? Are we going to respond to these, right? You asked a very broad question, and I can keep going on and on about this, but I will leave it at that, Sylvia.
Yeah, thank you very much. And, for highlighting, these issues of inequalities and all the intersections that COVID has revealed. And, Professor Okafor said that what was there to begin with, it was, the exposure of what wasn't there. I'd like to also now open it to people who have questions. This is supposed to be a conversation. So if you have any questions, you want to put up your hand, put it in the chat, you're welcome to do so. And Tawanga?
Thank you, Professor Sylvia. So on the topic of diseases of the poor versus diseases of the rich, I was watching a BBC interview on vaccine apartheid, and we had Dr. Alakija come on, and she said if Africa was the first country where COVID-19 was founded and it came at the same speed, what do you think would have happened? How do you think the world would have responded? And her response was, based off of what just happened currently when they found out about Omicron, Africa would have been shut off from the world completely. No one would have come in, no one would have, we would have truly suffered as we were supposed to handle the disease by ourselves. There would have been no push for vaccines. As we said, it was a miracle that it happened. But do we think it's a miracle because only the global north was exposed to it too? And if it was just a global south battle, would there have been the same push? So that's my question out there for us to discuss, if anybody wants to jump in.
Regine, you are muted.
Sorry, I don't know why I keep clicking in. I think, Professor Okafor's metaphor or counterfactual, the one with say it emerged in another country, or the say that we had a vaccine in another country, would the arguments around, would the international, let's say Zambia had a vaccine, would the international legal agreement have, or legal interpretation of these human rights obligations that we have been any different? So I think, again, that counterfactual that you present is in the same vein, in the sense that, yes, had this been something that had happened in a remote part of the world or in a more closed regional setting, say in the global south, say just in Africa or say in sub-Saharan Africa, this would have not been the long-term issue that we're dealing with now. I think there's no question about that. I think that would have, the scenario would have been very different. It would have been one of what Professor Lee has already said of neglected diseases and not enough funneling of money to pharmaceutical industries to innovate in this domain. But I think that, travel restrictions are a very interesting example of how they're very interesting examples of political theater, I would say, because we know that travel restrictions don't really work. Like, they only slow down the spread of a virus by a few days, or a pathogen by a few days. And in particular, selective travel restrictions, that is to say, to ban foreign nationals from another country or 2 countries or 3 countries, but not other countries, because people find ways to travel and get to where they need to go anyway, right? So I think that that process of imposing travel restrictions is really political theater, and it becomes very, very easy to do when there's a country that is, I guess the word would be, expendable for them. And I think that was the case, that with what happened in Omicron, countries that didn't even have Omicron were getting travel restrictions slapped on them, right? Like, so I totally agree with you, but I think that something more rooted in the racist structures of our international legal system is also at play.
Thank you so much for that input, Rojan. Appreciate it.
Are there questions from the floor, so to speak, the virtual floor? Yes, Lisa. Please unmute and ask.
Yeah, hi, sorry, I'm not in my office, so I don't want to turn on my screen, but one way that I'm thinking about it, it's such a concerning issue, obviously, and you folks have handled it really well. But one lens that I think about it from is social movements, and I'm not talking about the truck cavalcade that's going through the country right now, but the other way around. When the call for boosters came out, I struggled myself to say, why are we getting boosters when there's a whole lot of people in the world that haven't had their first dose? And I haven't heard any social movement that's spoken up that way to say, you know, let's say no to vaccines because other people deserve them. And maybe I'm just missing it, but I just wonder if anybody has anything to say. I think Leslie Wood was on the call. I don't see her anymore though. But anyway, I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that.
I can speak to that because, you know, my research partner, Dr. Masoko Fala, you know, he was involved in a social movement of sort of galvanizing almost every public health official that, you know, was connected to the Ebola response and signing on to a letter, which I myself did, about the COVAX initiative and about sort of getting the intellectual property rights, things available to everyone, you know. And, you know, this has been done before. Jonas Salk, when he discovered the polio vaccine, refused to patent it, right? So there has been some social movements. You don't hear of them, right? He sent his letter, or the group's letter, to all the governments around the world, particularly in the global north, and they basically just ignored it, right? Because they're in a position to do so. Right, you know, you hear about the power dependency relationship or the principle of least interest. The party that has the least interest in the continuation of the relationship holds the power. You know, well, it's the global north that continually holds the power, and that, you know, and that's why they ignore what goes on. So the social movement, to get to your point, Lisa, really has to emanate from the global north.
Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead, Eugene. Yeah.
Just to add, I think there was actually a specific campaign that I led together with one.org around booster shots and withholding booster shots. So I shared the open letter. So this was back in September, before even Omicron had existed, or we knew that it existed. Unfortunately, the thing with these vaccines is as soon as you find data, right, and usually it comes in the form of a press release from the pharmaceutical company saying, oh, we've started to find that our vaccine is no longer as effective against the new variant, right? So as soon as that ends up happening, then you have a scenario where the country's rushing to give boosters. But at the time, we had been sending letters to Theresa Tam and others telling them to not put to not create a mass booster campaign like the way United States had done, because Canada had not done enough in donations and TRIPS waiver and all these other ways to kind of create vaccine equity. Unfortunately, such an open letter can no longer be done because of Omicron and because of the way Omicron does seem to evade the vaccine's effectiveness. But I think that's a problem of vaccine technology. It is not a problem of so the responsibility still stands to accept the TRIPS waiver, to accept manufacturing scale up. That is stuff that we don't need to, that we need to be focusing on more, I think, than the pressure that's been put on booster. I think that's a losing strategy.
Yeah, and I just, this is a very quick follow-up, Eugene, if you can take it up very quickly, because you've also talked about the fact, and you know, that in other places that international health regulations, the global health law remains crucial to preventing, detecting, and responding to COVID-19. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about how you think COVID has tested this global health law, and maybe Professor Okafor can also respond to you. You've talked about the fact that, yes, you know, this is something that is enshrined. It's not as if we are talking about something new in terms of human rights obligations and whatnot. So again, my question is, are there going to be any is anyone going to be held accountable? Is anyone accountable in this particular case? Like, is it just one of those things where it boils back down to a moral sort of argument?
Yeah, so I guess on global health law in particular, we have one legal instrument that should have governed this response, but it wasn't really conceived with a long-term strategy in mind of a 3-year or possibly longer pandemic. So that's the international health regulations of the WHO. It was revised in the aftermath of SARS, and the reason it was revised in the aftermath of SARS is because SARS revealed to the world really blatantly, very, very obviously, that we can no longer create just treaties on specific diseases here and there. We're in a globalized world, we're in an interconnected world, and especially with the way that we've gone about deforestation and treating our environment, zoonotic transmissions are far more likely, new novel viruses are far more likely. So we need a treaty to govern the global response to every single potential pathogen that could create a public health emergency of international concern. So that's the international health regulations. Now, the international health regulations has, I guess you could call it a tripartite of obligations. It has 3 key obligations. One is that countries have to notify the WHO as soon as they find an event in their country that could be causing a public health emergency of international concern. The second is that countries have to undertake to collaborate to build public health capacities in every country in the world to detect, respond, and prevent public health emergencies. And third is that when you do have a country that has an outbreak in its borders, you cannot mount a response that is disproportionate, and that's called the additional health measures. Other countries around the world cannot suddenly shut their borders just because of one small event that another country's detected that we don't know the significance of. The reason being, in the past, lots of countries used to close their borders in very dramatic ways to people from a country that has an outbreak, and that would cause an economic catastrophe, human rights catastrophe for the country that did have the outbreak and had to deal with it. So there was that move in after SARS to not let that happen again. Now, the problem with the international law that we have today is that it doesn't address access to vaccines specifically or access to medical countermeasures. And so that's the hope with the pandemic treaty, is that we need to understand that we have shared obligations as an international community when it comes to addressing pandemics. Those shared obligations don't just include information sharing, which is something that the European and global North countries have been very, very adamant about advancing in the new pandemic treaty, information sharing. That's not the only obligation we have to share. We also have an absolute obligation to share medical countermeasures, and information sharing and countermeasure sharing go hand in hand. And we need to understand that just as how we needed South Africa to report to us that it has a new variant in its borders, we need to help other countries as well to combat through those effective medical countermeasures that we know exist. So it's just that those shared obligations are not as clearly articulated in the international health regulations, and hopefully the pandemic treaty could address that.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Okafor.
Yes, I associate myself with what Regina has just said. The pandemic treaty, if adopted, may, emphasis on may, help, of course, as much as any treaty can help, but that is always a start, right? So the resource that is then deployed in sort of the real world, and there's a lot of work being done by civil society and all kinds of actors to try and put pressure on states. At the end of the day, it's the treaties are state is their show on states to do the right thing, include the right provisions, and so on. And that would be a good start. As we speak, work is being done to revise the draft. Is only a draft yet, draft UN Declaration on the Right to International Solidarity, which, if those revisions are adopted, will speak directly to some of these issues that we're discussing today. Now, of course, texts are just words, and even when adopted, the center of gravity will not lie in the text. It will remain in how those resources can be mobilized, again, to pressure states, even after the texts are adopted. We've seen how states on all sides of the North-South axis tend to kind of, again, pretend that the text is not in front of them when they think that their self-interest, lightened or otherwise, is implicated. So there will be no end for a need for pressure, to mobilization of civil society and so on, to make sure that the right things are done in future.
Yeah, thank you very much. And given where we are in terms of time, I'll probably now go to Harris for the last word, and maybe you can all jump in on the last word, which I will take from a question that is also question comment in the chat from Mohammed Sise. Mohammed, I don't know if you're here, you want to unmute and ask, but I can just go ahead and ask in the chat or read. Given that COVID-19 has yet again exposed the hypocrisy in operationalization of legal and moral principles that underpin global solidarity and human rights frameworks or discourses, isn't it time, A, to rethink these global frameworks or principles, and 2, turn more attention to solutions from the global south and from the global south and for the global south? And I suppose that actually also jives well with the question that I had, the last question: what are your predictions on how we survive this, if we do survive this, and how we go on? And it's good that the sociologists will start us off.
Yeah, no, thanks, Sylvia and Mohammed. Yeah, I mean, to consider Mohammed's question, is it time for the global south to be at the table? And, obviously the answer is absolutely that is the crucial. The legal scholars have talked about, the international health regulations and all that sort of thing. And this has, again, a long history, but it's a history that's traced to what was called the Treaty of Westphalia. Before the European states were warring with each other, and it was in no one's interest, to be in this sort of state of affairs. So they came together and they made this treaty, and the problem with this treaty was the treaty said that we're not going to interfere economically in another country's affairs, another nation state's affairs. This is what the treaty was about. But the problem with, cross-border, like environmental problems, like global warming, or infectious disease spread across border, or the international trade in illegal drugs, for that matter. These things that cross the border, how do you make an agreement on these things? Because each state is a sovereign unto itself, right? And so there's no overarching sovereign that can impose sanctions, if a treaty is violated. This is why they call it anarchic, right? And that's what international relations tends to be. So the challenge of developing international laws is a big one, right? But as Mohammed says, I think, to rise to that challenge, the global south, to deal with international problems, including climate change and other environmental problems, not just infectious diseases, need to be there because of how we're just so globally interconnected in the contemporary era, in ways that you couldn't even think of. Requires that all parts of the world be at the table when you're dealing with international stuff and have a say in it, right? You cannot just sequester problems anymore to one area of the world, right? This sort of thinking is wrong because you'll keep running into these environmental problems, infectious disease problems, and things like that continually, until everyone else is on the table. Now, Sylvia, you had a second question. What was that?
Your predictions on how we survive, if we survive.
Oh, yeah. You know what? Every disease outbreak has a closure to it. The development of herd immunity, it happens. I've often thought about, because people make the comparison to this 1918 Spanish flu, right? And what people forget is that there have been different waves of this flu that were coming back, and it would come, every few years, a different wave would kind of come back. But what's interesting about COVID-19 is we're dealing with different waves as well. We're just calling them variants, so you're the British variant, and then the Delta variant, then the Omicron variant, right? But these are waves. But why are they coming so fast? The answer is because of globalization. At least this is my speculation, right? Before, 100 years ago, they would take a long time for these waves to come back, and eventually the epidemic would end. But now we're going through these waves very quickly, developing vaccines very quickly. The virus mutates very quickly because it's able to do so today, and spread globally because of our interconnection. So in this globalized world of today, what is going to happen with the epidemic? On one hand, I am optimistic because all, these outbreaks, including pandemics, end. But on the other hand, we're giving plenty of opportunities because of our global way of life and our lack of global response for the virus to keep adopting and evolving and to evade our defense mechanisms, right? So now when they talk about we have to live with the disease endemically, I think that's where we're at, unfortunately. But that's only my opinion.
1 minute or a few seconds each, Professor Okafor and Regine.
I don't know where to start. I think let me just put in a plug for Cuba. And you wondering what's this old Marxist saying. That small island has a vaccine, has vaccinated almost all its people. This is to Mohamed Sisse's question. Right? It engineered it almost contemporaneously with the big pharma and their billions, and he vaccinated his people. And he wanted actually to ship vaccines. He doesn't have the money to the rest of the global south, but that money was blockaded, right? So Mohammed, there are models there. There are ideas, there are beginnings, hints at what South-South cooperation could look like. So why isn't the African Vaccine Facility, bringing money together to get, mass produce the Cuban vaccine? Why does it have to be Moderna, or Pfizer, right? Things like that. So there are various options out there. So I'll just leave it at that. This is 1 minute. Yeah.
Great. And I would second both comments that were made. And I think that reform is probably the better word than dismantling everything. I think that we, pragmatically speaking, we need international laws to deal with pandemics, but they're not good international laws. And so we need to reconfigure them and change them so that they have these interests at heart. One thing that we're really trying to do right now with the pandemic treaty is create an opening for broad civil society consultation, not just with civil society that is in official relations with WHO, but as broadly, just as broad as possible. The WHO, unfortunately, has a history of not being open to broad civil society participation. And so I think changing that and hearing more voices from states will be important. But I also think that, again, going back to that idea of pathogen sharing and access to medical countermeasures, these things go hand in hand. And many developing countries, many of the countries from the LMICs are trying to reassert their viral sovereignty by saying, we won't share viral samples, we won't share sequencing data if you're not going to be willing to share that resources as well on your end. And I think that's a very valid argument and a claim to make. And we have to support LMICs in making that argument at the international level.
Thank you very much, Regine, and thank you, Professor Okafor. Thank you, Professor Ali. We notice now that as it comes to the end, there's now more excitement. It's always like that. At the end of what appears to be the end of a feast or festival is when people actually now begin the conversation. And I think that is the best way to leave it, so that this is present in our minds as we continue these conversations in other fora, in other places, and perhaps there might be a part two that picks up on some of these points that you have brought up. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to our panelists for agreeing to come on a Friday afternoon to do yet another Zoom event with all the work that you're doing And again, to also thank Susan Foster for all of the work of coordinating, reaching out to people, and of course to Wanga for all the help behind the scenes, research assistance. So thank you so much, everybody, and let us go forth and perhaps take up the mantle of advocating for, vaccine equity in the world around us. Until the next event from the RCPS, thank you so much, and we'll see you again.
Thank you very much.